Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. I hope everyone is doing okay. So for this week, we're going to continue with the next chapter. We're going to talk about Islamic finance in general. So this will be the discussion on general characteristic of Islamic finance. Okay, so for today, what we're going to do is we're going to have an overview of Islamic finance, and we all gonna see the characteristic of Islamic finance. So by the end of today, by the end of this course, I hope you can understand the nature of Islamic finance, and you would be able to explain characteristic of Islamic finance. Okay. First, we're gonna have an overview of Islamic finance, just in general. Okay. So, first of all, what is finance? Right. So when we talk about finance, people often say that it is all about money, right? Anything money related is finance, right? But finance is actually concerns about resource allocation, management, acquisition, and investment. Of course, it's all related to money, right? But it concerns with these issues, right? Allocation of resources, management, acquisition, and investment related with money. So what is a financial system? Right. It's a big question, right? So actually financial system, we talk about financial system as a whole, is a set of institutions, right? We are not talking only about banks. We are also talking about insurance companies, stock exchanges, and anything that permit the exchange of funds, right? Even when we talk about bank, we are not talking about normal retail bank that we all often see, right? IMB, Maybank, right? There are also investment bank, right? The investment bank, they have a special names, say IMB investment or Maybank investment or Kenanga investment, right? And there are other niche banks that operate in a small structure, so to speak, and they are not involving retail, right? Same like insurance companies or takaful in that particular context, right? You might often know about what Great Eastern Takaful or Great Eastern Insurance, or maybe Zurich, or maybe Pru BSN, right? But there are also re-takaful companies, right? Re-takaful or reinsurance companies, right? Some institution above that particular insurance companies who actually insured the insurance companies, right? And in the context of banks, for example, in Malaysia, we have PIDM, for example, right? Perbadangan Industri Deposit Malaysia, right? So they are the one who guaranteed some amount of the money from the depositors, right? We also have a Bank Negara who monitor everything, right? Everything related to banking institution, right? We have a Securities Commission, right? Who monitor everything that is related with particularly listed companies, right? And also issuance of in securities market, right? Issuance of bonds, sukuk, for example, right? So there is a big institutions right there, right? It's not just a normal bank that you often see, right? Or not just takaful companies that you know, right? But there are a lot more behind that, right? Who, so to speak, backing up each other, right? So this is a whole financial system that we talk about, right? And even when we talk about financial system in Malaysia context, we are not in silo, right? We are dependent upon financial system in other parts of the world, right? So we have connections with financial system in Asian market, for example, with Singapore, with Thailand, Indonesia, right? And in a global context, we have connection with China, we have connection with the US, right? So we are, in some context, we are obliged to follow some of the rules set up by institution in the US, for example, right? And when it's a global and interrelated, right? We are not operating in silo, right? So for example, when there are FDI, for example, we talk about foreign direct investment, right? This money will be bring by the banks from that particular country, right? For example, we talk about US, right? So they transferred the money from the banks in the US to banks in Malaysia, right? But for the process to occur, they must get approval from authority bodies in the US, right? And at the same time, they must get approval from authority bodies in Malaysia, right? And again, usually there are some insurance involved, right? To when you talk about investment, there are some insurance that the company will buy to ensure that if anything happens, they are at least some way protected, at least some of it, right? So they will need to buy insurance maybe from their countries in the US, or maybe they will have to buy from Malaysia, or maybe both, right? So there are lots of elements involved in that particular things, right? So when we talk about financial system, you must understand is a financial system as a whole, right? Not only small banks, right? Okay, so financial system exists on firm, regional, and global levels, right? So when companies, for example, they want to raise fund, they can either go for initial public offering, IPO, or listing in the stock market, or they can also raise fund via issuance of sukuk, right, or bond, right, for that matter, right? So when they issue sukuk or bond, they can issue a domestically denominated bonds or sukuk, which is in ringgit Malaysia. So their target market, they will sell only in Malaysia, right? But at the same time, they can also sell dollar denominated, or maybe renminbi denominated, or Japanese yen denominated, or Singapore dollar denominated bond or sukuk, right? So when you issue a different currency bond or sukuk, you would need to engage with authorities, with banks, with lawyers, for example, etc., that involve in a global level, right? So it can be limited to the firm level, but it can go to regional and also go to global levels, right? And financial system includes sets of rules and practice that borrowers and lenders use to decide which project get financed, who finance projects, and term of financial deals, right? Okay, so in this matter, there are not only one or two person involved, right? For example, I give you an example about issuance. Want to raise fund via issuance of sukuk, right? So when you want to raise fund via issuance of sukuk, you will need to involve with the investment banker. You need to have involvement from lawyers, right? They need to draft the contract and sort of, and you need to involve with the authorities, right? In this context, maybe Securities Commission, right? You have to have engagement with in the context of sukuk. You would need to have an engagement with Sharia advisors, right? You have to have a board of trustees as well, right? So there are a lot of people involved, right? When these people involved, there are set of rules and practice, right? So for example, when you want to issue a sukuk, the banks will ask, investment will ask, why you need to issue this sukuk, right? The fund, what you gonna do for which project, right? What is the return for this project, right? How much the investors will get from this issuance of sukuk, right? What is their return? 3%, 4%, 5%, right? What is their risk, right? Is it the high risk, low risk, right? So there are lots of things that's going on in that particular matters, right? Okay, so borrowers, lenders, and investors exchange current fund to finance project. It can be either for consumption or productive investment, and can also to pursue a return on their financial asset, right? So you can use, for example, we talk about raising money, right, via sukuk. You can use to finance project, right? For example, you want to build hospital, you want to build rail, you want to finance a highway, you want to finance a school, for example, right? So you can use that, right? And you can also use for consumption or productive investment, right? For example, you want to raise sukuk to build more factories, for example, right? You want to raise fund to finance your plantation project, right? You want to plant 100,000 palm oil trees more, right? So you need money for that, right? So you can either borrow, right, or you can raise fund, right? And then you can also to pursue a return on your financial asset, right? For example, you want to maybe you just want to sell your assets, right? Or maybe there are things that are going on. For example, you raise bond, you raise fund for the bond via bond to just give return to your shareholders, right? So there are that particular things going on, right? Okay. So in general, this I just talk in general, right? Of course, in reality, there are a lot of other things going on, right? So in the financial system, there are flow of funds, right? From the financial market, it's actually from the savers. Right? We start from the savers, right? Uh, Lenders or savers, right? They give money. They give money to the financial market, right? We save money in the banks, right? When we get salary, we save 500 ringgit per month, for example. Or maybe we put money, we have a contribution to the EPF, for example, right? We have a contribution to tabung haji, for example, right? We put 200 ringgit, 300 ringgit tabung haji, right? Maybe we put some amount in investment. We put 100 ringgit per month in Wahid investment, for example, right? We put 100 ringgit per month in ASB, for example, right? So there are savings that we make, right? So of course, when we talk about personally, individually, 100 ringgit, 200 ringgit, 500 ringgit, nothing, right? It's nothing. It's a very small amount, right? But when we talk about a million people, for example, doing that, right? A million people contribute about 500 ringgit every month to the financial system. That's about what, 500 million per month, right? Being deposited into banks or financial institution, right? So this money need to be managed, right? If you just leave it there, the investors or the savers will not get any return, right? Okay, so so there are the rules of financial intermediaries or banks. We talk about banks, tabung haji or EPF or whatever, right? Who use that particular money, right, to do investment, right? And that particular investment can be direct or indirect, right? It can be for projects, right? For example, we put money in tabung haji. Tabung haji use that particular money to buy hotels, for example, right? Or to buy plantation, right? Or to buy assets that can generate money, right? For example, you buy highways, right? Or you fund highways, right? You can do that directly, right? But it can also be indirectly, right? How? Indirectly, you can use the financial markets, right? Financial intermediaries, right? Okay, so for example, we put money into tabung haji or EPF, right? What will happen is that they will buy shares in companies, right? Stocks, engage in stock markets, right? It can be in Malaysia, it can be overseas, right? Tabung haji or EPF can also buy subscribe for sukuk or bond, right? So the return from their investment later on will be given back to the investors, which is normal person like us lah, who put the money, right? If the investment is good, yield good return, the return will be high, right? But the investment is not good, so that's a different story, right? In the case of tabung haji, the deposit money is guaranteed by the government, so we are safe, right? In the case of ASB, for example, again it is guaranteed, right? In the case of banks, if you put money in the banks, the deposit money is guaranteed, right? But of course, when we talk about banks, the yield or the return that the banks give is just lower, very low, right? So, but when you get involved in another type of investment, right, that is more high risk, right? So, for example, in unit trust, for example, right, higher risk, right? So that's when you can get potentially higher return, right? But at the same time, you are exposed to loss, right? And the loss can be you can lose everything, right, in that particular context, right? So that's the whole story, that the basic general stories that we can capture, right? So when the financial we talk about EPF, for example, buy share in stocks, buy shares, right? Or tabung haji buy shares, right? So the companies that operate, for example, EPF buy shares in Malakoff, for example, right? Or Tenaga, right? Tenaga Nasional, easier to see, right? So if Tenaga Nasional Berhad make a good return on their investment, on their business on that particular year, they will give a good return to the EPF, right? Which in turn will give a good return to us, normal person, right? But if the Tenaga have a problem during that particular year, right, they get a lower return, or maybe they have a loss on that particular year, that will also affect us, that would affect EPF, tabung haji, and indirectly affect us as the investors, right? Okay, so that's a whole general, this is just a general story about a flow of funds, right? Okay, so in conventional financial system, they subscribe to the value neutral system, right? What does it mean? It relies on the assumption that human beings are rational in decision making, right? So when human beings are rational in decision making, they prescribe the doctrine of self-interest, right? What does it mean? By satisfying individual self-interest, one will in general contribute to the economic development of the society as a whole, right? In simpler words, every human being wants the best for themselves, right? They want to get the if you do investment, you want to have the highest return possible, right? So if you want to have the highest return possible, you would make a rational decision in finding companies that or investing in companies that can provide you the highest return possible, given a certain number of risks, right? Given the risk profile, we are talking about risk reward return, risk return profile, right? Metrics. Okay, so again, for that to happen, companies who are good, who will have more investors, right? So that's a motivation for any companies who are not that good to perform as well as the good company, right? So after that happen, that would contribute towards the economic development of the society as a whole, right? Because everyone wants to pursue greatness, right? Wants to be good, right? So that's the system that we talk about in the conventional financial system. But for the Islamic worldview, right, there are a concept of istikhlaf being discussed, right? So human being has responsibility towards Allah. Human being has responsibility towards the individual and the ummah as well, right? So the relationship between individual and Allah is an implicit contract, right? It is ingrained upon the human being, right? But the relationship between individual and the ummah, that's where the contract come in, right? The concept of Sharia Islamiyah come in, where there are financial contracts involved. We do mudarabah, musharaka, or whatever Islamic transaction that we can use, right? So in the concept of istikhlaf, right, the principle of istikhlaf implies that man is not the absolute owner of the resources, right, but rather he or she is entrusted with them and may utilize them only for the betterment of mankind, right? So we are not the owner, right? We are just someone who is being entrusted with that particular asset or money, right? And we have to utilize that asset or money for the betterment of mankind, right? Therefore, we is accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for our conduct on earth, right? So in Islam, the concept of trust is linked with responsibility, right? And this implies that wealth is entrusted upon a human being is indeed a responsibility that will be accounted for in the hereafter. So next, we're going to talk about what is Islamic finance, right? So when we separate the two terms, right, we talk about Islam and finance. Islam is characteristic based upon certain principles underlined by Sharia, right? And finance comprised of Islamic financial market institution that deal with resource allocation, management, acquisition, and investment. It also involved with risk, transformation, and management, right? So we talk about Islamic finance is a provision of financial service on a basis that is compliant with the principles and rules of Islamic commercial jurisprudence, right? We talk about fiqh muamalat, right? So fiqh muamalat is a branch of Islamic Sharia jurisprudence, right? And then when we talk about transaction, right? As a Muslim, we want every transaction to be Sharia compliant, right? But what does it mean by Sharia compliance? We talk about and everything must be Sharia compliance for Muslim, right? We want everything to be halal in accordance with Sharia, but what is a Sharia compliance, right? Is it just enough for it to be a Sharia compliance, right? You just comply with the Sharia, right? What about the maqasid, right? The real intention of that particular Sharia rules, right? You do not have to comply with that, right? So that's a big question, right? Because when we talk about Islamic finance in practice currently, right? Of course, the transaction is Sharia compliance, right? Everything, right? Everything, almost everything, and that is transaction in Islamic finance use is a Sharia compliance, right? But does it really fulfill the real maqasid of Sharia compliance, right? Why Islam asks to do this, right? So in Islamic financial contract, we follow that, right? We do that, right? But we never ask why Islam asks to do this, right? And we do not comply with that, right? So don't worry, we'll discuss a bit about the Sharia compliance in the later slide. And in Islamic finance, basically we follow the rule of Sharia, right? So it is a relationship with the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it covers all aspects of human life, right? So in particular, when we talk about Islamic finance, it relates to the transaction, right? Muamalah transaction activities that we involve in, right? Okay, so next we're going to see the characteristic of Islamic finance. Okay, so what are the characteristics of Islamic finance? Of course, the famous one when we talk about Islamic finance, it must be from riba, gharar, and maisir. The three things, right? Riba, gharar, and maisir, right? But then there are lots of other things as well, right? So the fundamental one we always talk, Islamic finance must be free from riba, right? Islamic finance transaction must also be free from ihtikar, right? Or hoarding, right? So the elements of hoarding, right? The actions of hoarding things are not in compliance with Sharia, right? For example, during the festive season, for example, there are traders who hoard items, right? Who hoard sugars, who hoard rice, for example, in the hope of that the price of that will increase. And when that prices of that particular items increase, they can sell at higher prices, right? So it is not a Sharia compliance, right? It must be free from qimar or maisir, element of gambling, right? So the concept of gambling also does not mean simple gambling that we understood, right? There are lots of other things we need to dive deeper on that, right? And then Islamic finance must be also free from jahl mufdi ila niza, which is a lack of information leading to dispute, right? So Islamic finance must be clear, right? The contract must be clear. Everything needs to be transparent so that information that is shared does not lead to dispute, right? And then Islamic finance must also be free from najash, right? We talk about the practice of najash, which is raising prices by making false bid, right? So but then bank muzayadah is allowed, right? The sale with increase in prices is allowed, right? But we cannot make false bid, right? For example, maybe we have a cartel, right? For example, we have plan, right, with 10 people, right? So to speak, we create an artificial demand, for example, right? Or when we buy things, we want to surprise the items prices, right? We have a cartel, for example, the price may be 50 ringgit per kilo. So we have a cartel of 10 people or suppliers, right, who are going to buy that particular item. We say, everyone going to say, no, right now everything, the price is quite cheap, right? We can get it 40 from other sellers, right? You can get a 45 from other sellers, right? You artificially, right, you form a cartel and you artificially lower the price, right? Or you can also artificially raise the price, right? For example, you go to auction, right? So you want the price of the house, for example, to be higher than what it should be, right? So you have a cartel, about 10-15 people go there to the auction and raise the price, right? But for the genuine buyers who really want to buy that particular house, they are so to speak feeling attached to it, right? Or maybe being emotionally driven, right, to also bid for higher price, right? So that's a no in Islamic finance, right? And then we talk about gharar, right? Gharar can be small gharar or big gharar, lots of gharar involved, right? So when there's a lot of gharar involved, Islamic finance does not allow it, right? But a small gharar, it is acceptable, right? It depends on the level of gharar, right? And Islamic finance must be also free from ikrah or coercion, right? You cannot force people to enter into any transaction. You cannot force people to buy a particular things. You cannot force people to sell a particular things, right? When there are elements of coercion or force involved, the contract is considered as null and void, right? So in particular for Islamic finance industries, they need the elements of redha must be there, right? when you do transaction, both parties must have rida, right? Must be willing to do that particular transaction, right? And then Islamic finance must be also free from element of exploitation of needs, right? You cannot exploit people, right? You cannot exploit particular needs of people, right? Okay, so again, Islamic finance is constructed upon the principle of brotherhood and cooperation, right? We talk about ta'awun here, right? So when you do transaction, when you buy things, you are actually not only helping yourself but also helping the other people, right? And the concept of ta'awun or cooperation is in particular is very much discussed upon or very much implemented in the takaful system, right? You are not paying for your premium, right? But you are contributing to help other people's, right? And when you are in a situation, in particular situation, the other people will help you, right? So, but of course, this is the concept that we talk about. The implementation might be different, right? And Islamic finance is a system grounded on moral and ethical framework of Sharia, right? It is grounded on moral and ethical framework of Sharia. But again, that's in theory, right? The implementation of it might be different, right? So that's why we see lots of corruption, mismanagement, etc. that happens even in the field of Islamic finance, right? The transaction, you are raising sukuk, for example, right? But the money that is being raised from that particular sukuk issuance is being used for non-Sharia compliance activities, right? This happened, right? So of course, that then raises a particular question whether we need to put more surveillance of the money involved, or we just leave it to the one who got money, right? Because again, it might not be a question of whether we should not take into account what the other people will use, right? For example, if a person goes to get financing from Islamic banks, right, and he or she used that particular money to buy alcohol, for example, right, should the banks concern about that, right? Should the bank monitor the money use, right? So that raises a question, right, whether where is the limit of involvement of Islamic financial institution, right? Should we stop at I mean, when, of course, when the people goes to get a financing from the banks, he or she will state what is the money is going to be used, right? But then if he or she use that particular money for different things, can banks take action? I don't know. So that's a line that maybe some lines that we need to draw, right? The boundaries that we need to draw so that we don't go too much into the privacy or life of the person, but at the same time, you want to ensure that if the money is raised, in particular by Islamic finance institution, and in particular, when we talk about the money related to government, right? Related, when we talk about government, means is the responsibilities of related with the population, the people, right? The rakyat, right? So we need to make there need to be more scrutiny on that, right? So again, that's up to discussion on the boundaries that we need to draw, right? Okay, so that's all for today. Inshallah, hopefully you have some ideas, some views on this particular thing. So we shall continue again next week. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.